Hi there, Matt Allington here, and thanks for joining me for my talk about variables in DAX. So you may know me from Accelerator BI, also from the company Skillwave.training, which is a joint venture between myself and Ken Pools. And one of the things I'd like you to know is that we have a 20% promotion on at the moment on all of our courses at Skillwave.training. So if you find the learnings from today useful, please consider having a look over at Skillwave.training and see what courses we have available that you can learn from. Okay, let's talk about variables in DAX. I want to start off by giving a bit of a definition on the word variable. So you may remember variables or algebra from school. So if I was to say take x and y, I can assign a value 2 to the value x, 3 to the value y, and then once I've assigned those values, I can use the variables x and y in place of the original values. So once I've assigned a value to the variable, then I can add those variables together, I can multiply those variables and so on. So in its simplest sense, that's the concept of a variable, just in case you weren't clear what the topic is all about. Now, one thing to note within the DAX language is that you cannot reassign a value once it's been assigned to a variable. So if I assign the value of 2 to x, it's not permissible to take x plus 1 and end up with the value 3. You can't change the value of a variable once it's been assigned a value. And so, and look, there is some little nuances around this, but essentially that's the correct statement, is that you cannot reassign a value once the variable has been defined. The reason there's a little bit of nuance is because it is possible to put a variable inside an iterating function such as SUMX, or in a calculated column, something that gets executed multiple times. And if you're within an iterating function, the variable gets executed many times, which is different to changing the value as you progress. So variables in DAX are more like a constant in reality than they are a variable, but despite that, they're called variables, and I'm going to give you a bit of a demo on how you can use them. Now, just a couple of key things to know. So variables can be used to assign values, just like the values that I showed you just then, but they can also be used to assign tables. So as you get a deeper understanding of the DAX language, you'll know that, that the DAX formula language allows you to create values as you would do in a measure, but it also allows you to generate tables, and those tables are typically used inside a measure, or they might be used inside a calculated column. And you can assign values and tables to variables. That's perfectly permissible. So you can actually use variables to make your functions more efficient. I'm going to give you a demo on that. You can also use variables to make formulas easier to understand. And so back in the days of Power Pivot for Excel, so when I first started doing this probably 7 years ago now, there was no such thing as a variable. And if you had a very complex measure, you would typically break that very complex measure up into 4 or 5 different sub-measures. So you write measure 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then bring them all together in one sort of master measure to rule them all. And that was the best way of breaking a complex problem down into pieces back in the day when Power Pivot for Excel was around. Well, it's still around now, but also we have Power BI. And so I tend not to do that anymore. I tend not to write interim measures. I tend to use variables inside a single measure because it's easier for control and debugging purposes. And one of the real benefits of variables are that it just makes everything easier to write. It makes it easier to understand. So if you were reading a formula that I wrote using variables, it would be much easier for you to understand what I'm doing. And you can also use the technique to debug your formulas. Okay, so that's the background. Let me jump over to AdventureWorks, and I've got my standard AdventureWorks database. This is my simplified AdventureWorks database, and so I've got 5 tables. This is a simplified star schema. And if I come over here, I'm going to start off just with that XY example that I used before. So I'm going to write a new measure. I'll just call this test 1. And I can now define a variable. So I'm going to just zoom this up a little bit. So the way variables work is you use the var keyword, and as soon as you use the var keyword, at some point in time, you must use the return keyword. So you define a variable first, you can define as many variables as you want, and after you finish defining the variables, then you use the return keyword. So I could say x equals 3, and then shift enter, couple of tabs, var y equals 4, shift enter, return x times y. And in its simplest sense, that is a very simple variable formula, and I'm going to put that in. So the answer is 12. So 3 4s are 12, and so on. Okay, so in the most simple use case, that's how you use a variable. But please do not use x and y for your variable names. It's not a good name for a variable. One of the benefits of variables is that you can give it a good and useful name. So just look at the difference. What if I was to say width and length, and then instead of x times y, I can say width times length. Okay, of course the answer is going to be the same because all I've done is use a different name for the variables. The formula is the same. But notice how much easier it is to understand this formula now that I've given it some context. I've used the variable names to help give the formula context. And this is one of the benefits of using formulas within your measures. Now, something that I should point out is that you're not allowed to start a variable with a number. So you can't use a number as the first character of a variable, although it is permissible to use a number as a later character. So as long as it's not the first character in your variable name, it's perfectly permitted to use a number. There's also some special characters that you can't use. So I think percentage you're not allowed to use, and so on. So there are some naming conventions. You're also not allowed to give variables the same names as measures, and I think tables. So there's a few little rules like that. All right, so that's the first demo showing you what a variable is. Let me jump over to a second demo where I want to talk about efficiency. So let me show you what I've got here. So I have two measures. I've got a total sales measure and I have a total cost measure. And I'm going to calculate the margin percentage. Now, margin percentage, if you understand the retail industry, it's the sell price, subtract the cost price, that gives you the margin, and then you divide that by the sell price. That's called margin percentage. And so if I was to write that measure, I'll call this margin percent. That would be divide, and I would say total sales subtract total cost and divide it by total sales. Okay, so that's my margin percentage, and this will give me the correct answer. I might just throw a percentage formatting on that. And there we have it, that's the correct answer. Now the point I want to raise here is that this total sales measure is being evaluated twice within this formula. You can see that the total sales measure is being evaluated twice. And so there's at least a potential to improve the efficiency of this formula by changing the formula and using variables. And so the way I might change this formula is to put in a new line. I'll define a variable and I'll call this variable sales amount. You can call it whatever you want. And I'm going to assign the measure total sales to the variable sales amount. Once I've done that, I need to do a shift enter, which I didn't do. So shift enter, and then I can use the return keyword. I'll just bring this back up. And now instead of using the measure twice, I'm going to use my variable sales amount. And when I do this, it's going to give me the same answer, of course, because there's nothing logically different with this formula. What's different is that the measure total sales only needs to be evaluated once. Now, it is worth me pointing out that this particular measure is not going to make any discernible performance improvements because it's a very efficient formula anyway. And also the developers are in constant development mode for making the DAX language more efficient. And so it is at least possible that the developers at some point in time could change the way a measure is evaluated, and they could make it more efficient by assigning a variable underneath the hood. If that was to happen at some point in time, then there would be no logical or performance benefit of making the formula look like the one on the screen. But I want to explain to you that at least in concept, that's something that you could do. All right, so let me jump over to my third demo, which is to tell you that you can't reassign values once they've been assigned within a variable. And so I'm going to write a measure, and this one it will be flawed. So this will be total sales of bikes. And I would normally write this measure, calculate total sales where product category is equal to bikes. Okay, now if I bring that measure in there, as you can see, I'll bring total sales in so that you can see that as well. And you can see that my new measure, total sales of bikes, is giving me a different result. But to demonstrate the point that variables are immutable, once they've been assigned a value, they can't change the value. I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. I'll do my sales amount first. And then I'm going to use the return, and I'm going to, instead of using the measure, I'm going to put my variable here. Now watch what happens to the answers, 29.3, 28.3. When I make this change, you'll notice that I go back to this 29.3 here. So what's happening is that this variable is assigned in the initial filter context. So the variable is assigned its value depending on what the filter is in the visual. Then after the return statement, you cannot change the value of the sales amount. So even though I'm now trying to put a new filter on product categories bikes, it's not going to have any impact on this variable sales amount. And so you cannot change the value of a variable after it's been assigned. The exception is if you're using variables inside a SUMX or a calculated column where the formula has been executed many times, then yes, the variable can effectively be reassigned. But technically it's the same formula being executed many times rather than reassigning a value of your variable. So just keep that in mind. You can't do that. All right, so I'm going to show you one more example, and this is a little bit more complex, but this is exactly where I would naturally use variables within the DAX language. And so I want to come up with this formula, rolling 30-day average sales. Now I have a version of the formula over here, and so this is more complex. This is using an inbuilt time intelligence function, dates in period. So I'm calculating the total sales, and I'm using the dates in period function to determine which days in the past do I want to include inside my formula. So what this function does is it goes back in time and grabs the last 30 days, and then right at the end I divide that formula by 30 to get the average daily sales. Now this actually is not a 100% correct formula, because this formula here is actually taking the sales from 2 days and dividing them by 30. So that's not correct. This formula here is taking the sales from 4 days and dividing it by 30. So that's not correct either. And so I am going to write the correct version of the formula, and I'm going to use variables to rewrite this formula, but also hopefully so that you'll understand it a little bit better. So I'll write a new measure. Now when I write functions with variables, more complex functions with variables, sometimes I just like to start with the word work in progress. So what I'm saying to myself is this is not the final version of the formula. This is my work in progress. It's going to do different things as I test it out. And so if I was to start with max of the calendar date, now of course I know how to write this formula, but I'm using that that fact to use variables to explain to you how the formula works. So let me put this work in progress in. And when I write a formula max of the calendar date, notice that on the 2nd of July, it returns the 2nd of July. So this is the international date format, not US date format. So, but when I get to the total, there is no filter on the calendar date, and therefore the maximum date will be the maximum date inside my calendar table. So that's the way the max function works when it's used in a simple measure like this. And so now using variables, I can start to build out my formula so it's easier to understand. And you can see here that I need to use the max function inside my dates in period function. But at this point, it's not clear what it does. Like, why am I using max inside this dates in period function? It's not clear. But by using variables, I can start to give descriptions to the individual pieces of my formula so that it's a little bit easier to understand. So I'm going to define a variable, and this variable is going to be called last date in table. And so I'm now going to use max, and then what I would typically do is just go return the last date in the table. And of course, when I do that, I'm going to get the same result as I had before. All right, so the second thing I'm going to do is I'm now going to use a variable to generate this dates in period table. And so I'll come back here, and this is one of the concepts that I told you before, is that a variable doesn't have to have a value, it could be a table. So this will be my filtered table, and so that will be the function dates in period. Now, dates in period is an inbuilt time intelligence function, and whenever you get one of these time intelligence functions, you normally will know because the first parameter is dates. And whenever you see the word dates, what that means is tell me where your calendar date column is. And in my case, it's called calendar date. Now, when you write these functions, always use the IntelliSense. The IntelliSense is there to help you write a formula. So dates in period, it's saying, where is the date column in your calendar table? So that's the first parameter. Now it's saying, what date do you want to start from? How many intervals do you want to move by? And what type of interval is it? And so I want to start from the last date in the table. And in fact, it's the last date in the filtered table, or in the table visual. I mean, if you give this a good name, it will be much easier to understand what it does. So I'm going to start from the last date in the table visual, so 12th of July in the case of this cell here. And now it's saying, how many intervals do you want to move? Well, this is a 30-day rolling average, so it'll be minus 30. And then what type of interval? Well, it's a day. And now I close brackets. Okay, now if I try and return filtered table, this is going to throw an error. And you might like to have a think about why that's thrown an error. I'll bring the formula back up on the screen. The reason it's returned an error is that this is a table. You are allowed to assign a physical table, or in this case it's a virtual table, to a variable, but you can't return a table as a measure. It must be a value. So what I could do is I could count how many rows there are in the table. So this is, if you like, this is a bit of a test measure. So by counting how many rows are in my table, I'm able to get a visual confirmation of what's going on. So you can see that for my first date, I have a single row in my filtered table. For my second date, I have 2 dates in my table, and so on all the way down until I get to the 30th of the month. Then I have 30 days in my filtered table. And from that point on, it just remains at 30. And so if you come back and have a look at my formula up here, what I did before was I was to say return, calculate total sales using my filtered table as the filter, and then I divided it by 30. So that's the formula that I've written previously, and I should be getting the same result here as I got in my earlier version. But of course, this is not correct, because on the first date, on July the 1st, I'm dividing the total sales for a single day by 30. So that's not correct. So there's a couple of ways I could fix this formula. One way to fix the formula would be to say, well, I know this formula is incorrect until I reach the 30th day, which is the 30th of July. So one way to fix this formula would be to say if the last date in table visual is greater than or equal to, now I can hard code a date, so 2016, the 7th month and the 30th. So basically after the 30th of July, then this is a valid result. So this should work. This formula is now correct, because if we've got less than 30 days in the visual, it returns blank. And as soon as I've got 30 days in my visual, it gives me the average daily sales, which you can see this is still correct. It's just that these incorrect numbers have now been removed. So this is correct. There's nothing wrong with doing it this way, but I actually think there's a better way of doing it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a new variable that tells me how many days are there in the filtered table. So this will be my, I'll call it count of days. And that will be count rows, the same formula as I wrote before, count rows of the filtered table. And so now this is where it's pretty good practice to define a variable, something like this. The reason I like to do this, I learnt this trick from Daniel Musluk, who's a very smart DAX Power BI MVP living here in Sydney in Australia. The reason I like to do this is it makes it very easy to jump back and forth. I can come back and test each of my previous variables without having to make a major change to my formula. So I can now return count of days. So I'm very easy to jump back and check to make sure that that part of the function is working correctly. So it is all the way up to the day 30. Now I know it's working correctly. I can get rid of this because I don't need this logic anymore. And my result will simply be divided by the count of days, and then I can return the result. And so now I get a number for every single date in my table. If I've got 4 days worth of sales, it's dividing it by 4 days. And of course, that's therefore going to be technically correct. I mean, it's not really a 30-day average. It's actually a 4-day average, but I'm going to rename this now rolling 30 days variable. So technically in the first 29 days, it's not a rolling 30-day average, but I think, and I need to include the word average so that we know it's not an aggregate. And so, so technically it's not technically a 30-day rolling total. However, I think it's more correct and more useful than using the other approach. Okay, so that's all. Thanks for joining. Thanks for watching the video. Just a reminder that SkillWave does have a 20% discount on all of the courses that's running from now through till the 12th of September. There's a QR code there. You can see the link to the shop. Go and have a look at all the training courses that we've got available, and I'd love to see you in the private forum at skillwave.training or maybe on one of my live training courses.